Well, welcome back to our study through the minor prophets. We're going to continue on in Hosea today. We're going to pick up in verse 4 of chapter 6 and go into chapter 10 to verse 15. If you haven't read that already, I do encourage you to go ahead and read that before watching this video. I do want to apologize for the few days that we took off from this study. We wanted to take the weekends off, in which we will do that every single weekend. We'll do this video series Monday through Friday. But then yesterday was Katie's birthday, and I just wanted to give her and Sadie my absolute attention, and just to celebrate Katie's 29th year on this earth, and just to show her how much I love her and show her how much I'm thankful to be her husband. And so we had an absolutely amazing day yesterday. If you haven't, just send Katie a text or a message on Instagram, Snapchat, or Facebook, wherever you communicate with, just to encourage her. I know she'll be blessed to hear from you. But today we jump back into chapter 6, starting in verse 4. So what we've seen so far, just in the study of Hosea alone, in the minor prophets, the first of the 12, that God called Hosea, this prophet, this man of God, to go and minister to the northern people. And these people were living lives of unfaithfulness. They were living lives of wretchedness and wickedness and sin. And they've broken off the covenant that God made with them back in Exodus, where God says, "You will be my people. I will be your God." And he made that covenant with them. But they ultimately dishonored God by the way they were living. And they were living lives of destruction, as we'll see here today. So God used the story of Hosea to marry this woman named Gomer, whose name meant completion. And she was chasing for completion in every single thing except for her husband. And ultimately, we do know that they had one child together named Jezreel. Then they had two more children. But we can read from Scripture that those two did not belong to Hosea. She most likely had them with another man or with other men. And one child's name was Not My People, and the other child's name meant No Mercy. And God was going to use the story of Hosea, Gomer, their children, just to show the people of God an example of the example of the way that they were living. And then he was going to show them how much he loved them. And he used Hosea as that declaration and displaying of love. As he chased down his wife after she had left him. He chased her down. He could have left and been happy, but he chased her down. He found her. He purchased her, and he restored her and says, "You will be my bride, and I'll be your husband." And he restored and redeemed the covenant, and he purchased what already belonged to him. And we said that message ultimately is what Jesus has done. They both have the same original Hebrew name, Yeshua, which meant salvation, and Jesus ultimately has come to bring back what already belonged to him as he purchases us and he redeems us by the blood that he shed on the cross for us. Hosea chapters 4 into chapter 6, it was all about God's condemnation just on the way that they were living. Here's the problems I have with you. Here's the controversy I have with your sin, as it said in chapter 4, And God pretty much just lays it all out there. He says, here's your sin. See it in its fullness. Examine it. And that was challenging just to look at, because then we challenge ourselves. So what would it look like if God stood before us and says, here's your sin? And we should see this never-ending scroll coming down in front of us as we are examining, this is the way we've been living. And then today's message, as we move into chapter 6, God's going to move from the story of Hosea to a story of condemnation. Now he's going to talk about the story of judgment. It starts off in verse 4. Look what it says. "What shall I do with you, O Ephraim? What shall I do with you, O Judah? Your love is like a morning cloud, like the dew that goes early away." So right there at the very beginning, he's showing them that they have abandoned him and they do not love him. Their love is like the morning cloud that disappears quickly, the dew that fades off the grass. It goes on to say in verse 5 and verse 6, "Therefore, I have hewn them by the prophets, I have slain them by the swords of my mouth, and my judgment goes forth as the light. For I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings." So these people were being people who were consumed with their religion, consumed not even the religion of Judaism. They were chasing after other religions as they were worshiping Baal, and they were doing some really weird rituals in their worship, whether that was involving sex, whether that was involving human sacrifice, all kinds of different things. And they were bowing down to idols. They were bowing down to things that they had seen made, wooden carved idols. Those were their gods, sacrificing to them. And God's showing them, I just desire your steadfast love. I have given you my steadfast love. I desire that steadfast love. In return, he's showing that he's a very jealous God. He's made this covenant with these people. He's extended his perfect love to them. He desires it back. And I desire, he says, I want the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. All those other things are just I don't want those. I just want your love, and I want you to acknowledge me. And throughout the next 4 chapters, we're going to see how these people constantly refuse to love him, how they constantly refuse to acknowledge him. Because if they were truly loving him, if they were truly acknowledging him, they would turn and repent from their sins and chase wholeheartedly back to him. But look what it says in verse 7. This is not how it goes. But like Adam, they transgressed the covenant. There they dealt faithlessly with me. They've broken off the covenant that was made with them, and they've dealt faithlessly with them. They've not been great people of God. They've not been great worshipers of God. They've not been great servants of God. And that's why over the next several chapters, we'll see how God just lays out their destruction. And that destruction that's ultimately going to lead to the judgment and the end of their kingdom. It starts off in chapter 7, just showing how destructive the crimes are of the people. We'll see examples of adultery, spiritually and physically. We'll see how they worship in ceremonies with their bodies, with sex. And their wickedness was so extreme. Look at verses 3 through 5 of chapter 7. Excuse me, I'm in the wrong chapter. Chapter 7, verses 3 through 5. By their evil, they make their kings glad. By their evil, they make their kings glad, and the princes by their treachery. Just even there, he's using words like evil, treachery. Verse 4, they are adulterers they are like a heated oven whose baker ceases to stir the fire from the kneading of their dough until it's leavened. Verse 5, on that day of their king, the princes become sick with the heat of wine. He stretched out his hand with the mockers. Verse 6, for with hearts like an oven, they approach their intrigue. All night their anger smolders, in the morning it blazes like a flaming fire. All of them are as hot as an oven, and they devour their rulers. All their kings have fallen, and none of them calls upon me. He's laying out there what some people have even gone on to say was probably an assassination attempt on their king. That they were basically destroying their kings. They were destroying their leaders. They were chasing after power. They were chasing after lust. They were chasing after all these different things. And is describing them as anger, adulterous people. Angry and adulterous people. Which is why it goes on, excuse me, my Bible app just shut down. He goes on to talk about not even just Israel itself, not even just the people of God are doing this, the leaders of the people of God are doing this. Look what it says in verses 8 through 16 in chapter 7. Ephraim mixes himself with the people. Ephraim is a cake not turned. Strangers devour his strength, and he knows it not. Gray hairs are sprinkled upon him, and he knows it not. The pride of Israel testifies to his face. The pride of Israel testifies to his face, yet they do not return to the Lord their God, nor seek him for all of this. So they claim to be seeking after God, yet they claim to be looking to God, crying out to God, but they are actually not even looking to him. Look how it describes Ephraim in verse 11, the northern people. Ephraim is like a dove, silly and without sense. Silly and without sense, like a bird is flying around aimlessly with no place to go, no home of its own. Destructiveness is all throughout chapter 6 and chapter 7, and it continues on into chapter 8. In chapter 8, the verses 1 through 14, God's going to show them just how hypocritical the nation of God is. These people who claim to be seeking him, they claim with their lips and they acknowledge him, but they really don't live for him. Go into chapter 8, verses 1 through 14. Set the trumpets to your lips. One like a vulture is over the house of the Lord, because they have transgressed my covenant. And let's think about that. Where do vultures fly over? They're flying over death. They fly over roadkill, and they eat and devour death. This is one like a vulture is over the house of the Lord, because they have transgressed my covenant and rebelled against my law. He's describing just how dead these people are. They are dead in their sin. They are dead in their trespasses. They claim with their lips, verse 2, that to me they cry, my God, we, Israel, we know you. But they don't actually show that. Look over verse 3. Israel has spurned the good. The enemy shall pursue him. They made kings, but not through me. They set up princes, but I knew it not. With their silver and gold they made idols for their own destruction. They say they know God, but they've established kingdoms, they've established rulers without acknowledging him. They say they believe in God, they know who he is, but yet they've made idols to worship. Verse 5, I have spurned your calf, O Samaria. My anger burns against them. How long will they be incapable of innocence? Verse 6, for it is time from Israel. A craftsman made it. It is not God. The calf of Samaria shall be broken into pieces. This idol that's been made for them. Verse 7, for they sow the wind, and they shall reap the whirlwind. The standing grain has no heads. It shall yield no flour. If it were to yield, strangers would devour it. Israel is swallowed up already. Is swallowed up already. They are among the nations of a useless vessel. Strong language being used throughout this. They will sow the wind and they'll reap a whirlwind that will destroy their crops. And in verse 8, Israel is swallowed up already. Are they among the nations as a useless vessel? This was supposed to be God's chosen vessel. It's supposed to be God's chosen people to show the world who he was. And yet now he's describing them as a useless vessel. Verse 9, for they've gone up to Assyria, a wild donkey wandering alone. Ephraim has hired lovers, going back to the beginning of chapters 1 through 3. Though they hire allies among the nations, I will soon gather them up, and the king and the princes shall soon writhe because of the tribute. Look at verse 11. Because Ephraim has multiplied altars for sinning, because they've multiplied altars for sin, they become to him altars for sinning. Were I to write for him my laws by the 10,000s, they would be regarded as a strange thing. As for my sacrificial offerings, they sacrifice meat and eat it, but the Lord does not accept it. Now he will remember their iniquity and punish their sins. He's showing them that not only have they caused a problem in their own country, they're causing problems around them as well. As they says that they've multiplied altars for sinning. They are leading everyone into sin, into wickedness, into evil. And God says, now he, meaning the Lord, will remember their iniquity and punish their sins. And what do the people of God do when they first hear this? It says, they shall return to Egypt. They shall return to Egypt. So what Israel tries to do now is they try to flee from God's punishment, from God's wrath. They try to go to Egypt. They try to hide from him, which makes no sense. Makes no sense because we cannot hide from a God who creates all things, who knows all things, who sees all things, and hears all things. How can you hide from God? We'll talk about that when we look at the story of Jonah. How can you run the opposite direction from a God? It just doesn't work that way. But then we'll see here in verse 1, chapter 9, that it doesn't really work out for them. Rejoice not, O Israel, exalt not like the peoples, for you have played the whore, forsaking your God. Strong language. You have loved a prostitute's wages on all threshing floors. Threshing floor and wine vat shall not feed them. The new wine shall fail them. They shall not remain in the land of the Lord, but Ephraim shall return to Egypt, and they shall eat unclean food in Assyria. They shall not pour out drink offerings of wine. It shall be like the mourner's bread to them. All who eat shall be defiled, for their bread shall be for their hungry only. I shall not come to the house of the Lord. What will you do on the day of the appointed festival, on the day of the feast of the Lord? For behold, they are going away from destruction, but Egypt shall gather them. Memphis shall bury them. Nettles shall possess their precious things of silver. Thorns shall be in their tents. The days of punishment have come, and the days of recompense have come. Israel shall know it. Showing them that they may feel like they are fleeing destruction by dishonoring God, by not acknowledging what he has said to them, and by fleeing to Egypt, but he's showing them, no, you're going to face destruction there as well. You will face destruction there as well, because Egypt shall gather them. The very people who used to enslave them, they shall gather them. Memphis shall bury them, and nettles shall possess their precious things of silver, and thorns shall be their tent. You may feel like you're fleeing destruction, but ultimately you are heading towards it. The days of the punishment have come. The days of recompense have come. Israel shall know. The prophet is a fool. The man of the Spirit is mad because of your great iniquity and great hatred. The prophet is the watchman of Ephraim with my God. Yet a fowler snares all in his ways, and a hatred in the house of his God. Verse 9, they have deeply corrupted themselves, as in the days of Gibeah. He will remember their iniquities. He will punish their sins. And we move into verse 10, he starts to use this kind of just how this idea of crops and planting as this metaphor. Look at verse 10. Like grapes in the wilderness, I found Israel. Like the first fruit on the fig tree. In this first season, I saw your fathers. Going back to when God made this covenant with them in the wilderness, he said, in that moment, I saw your fathers. I saw their first fruit, where they first believed, where they first acknowledged me, when they first followed me. But they did not continue. But they came to Baal Peor and consecrated themselves to the things of shame and became detestable like the things they loved. They started chasing after other gods. They started chasing after other religions, other nations, other desires, others' passions, and they disregarded and dishonored their Lord. Look at verse 11. Ephraim's glory, the glory of the people of God, shall fly away like a bird. That the glory that they have built up as a people with their great kingdoms, with their great leaders and their great prosperity, it will disappear. Just like their love disappeared, like the morning dew. Woe to them when I depart from them. Ephraim, as I have seen, was like a young palm planted in the meadow, but Ephraim must lead his children out to the slaughter. Give them, O Lord, what you will give. Give them a miscarrying womb and dry breasts. Every evil of theirs is in Gilgal. There I began to hate them because of the wickedness of their deeds. I will drive them out of my house. I will love them no more. And it starts showing this as terrible destruction that's coming to these people. Just filled with darkness, just filled with brokenness. And God ultimately speaks to them in chapter 10 about their final destruction. It says, Israel is a luxuriant vine that yields its fruit. The more his fruit is increased, the more altars he built. As his country improved, he improved his pillars. Their heart, listen to this, their heart is false. Now they must bear their guilt. The Lord will break down their altars and destroy their pillars. Talking about, again, the glory that they built up will be destroyed because they've not honored God. Verse 3, for now they will say, we have no king, for we do not fear the Lord. And a king, what could he do for us? They utter mere words with empty oaths. They make covenants so judgment springs up like a poisonous weed in their furrows of their field. The inhabitants of Samaria tremble for the calf of Bethaven. Its people mourn for it, and so do its idolatrous priests, those who rejoice over it, over its glory, for it has departed from them. The thing itself shall be carried to Assyria as a tribute to the great king. The very God that they have created, the very golden calf that was created in Samaria, will be taken away from them, and they will mourn for it, because they have bowed down to its idol. Verse 7, Samaria's king shall perish like a twig on the face of the waters. The high priest of Avon, the sins of Israel shall be destroyed. Thorn and thistle shall grow up on their altars. And they shall say to the mountains, cover us, and to the hills, fall on us. They will cry out in the face of destruction, in the face of this judgment. They'll cry out to be destroyed. From the days of Gibeah you have sinned, O Israel. There they have continued. Shall not against the unjust overtake them in Gibeah? When I please, I will discipline them, and the nations shall be gathered against them, when they are bound up for their double iniquities. God's saying, when I please, in the time that I desire, judgment will fall on Israel, and Israel will be destroyed for what they have done, the iniquities that they have. Look, it goes on to the last few verses of verse 11. Ephraim was a trained calf that loved to thresh, and I spared her fair neck. But I will put Ephraim to the yoke. Judah must plow. Jacob must harrow for himself. Sow for yourselves righteousness. Reap steadfast love. The same steadfast love that you have forsaken, the same steadfast love that you have refused to give me. Reap that steadfast love as you sow for yourself righteousness. Stop chasing after everything else and chase after righteousness. Break up your fallow ground, for it is time to seek the Lord, that he may come and rain righteousness upon you. I love that verse. Sow for yourselves righteousness, reap steadfast love, break up your fallow ground, for it is time to seek the Lord, that he may come and rain righteousness upon you. That's what he can do. But look what they have done, verse 13. You have plowed iniquity, you have reaped injustice, you have eaten the fruits of lies, because you have trusted in your own way, and in the multitudes of your warriors. Therefore the tumult of war shall arise among your people, and all your fortresses shall be destroyed. Judgment is coming to these people because they've chased after iniquity. They've been indifferent towards injustice. They have produced injustice, and they have been eating the fruit of lies. But it doesn't have to fall on them. They don't have to continue chasing. That's why God is judging them. That's why God's speaking this judgment to them, so they can ultimately return to him, so they can one day sow for themselves righteousness and reap his steadfast love. Break up your fallow ground, for it's time to seek the Lord, that he may come and rain righteousness upon you. In the following chapters, we will see about the restoration of Israel. Because the story does not end there, we'll see what God brings to these people. Ultimately, destruction does come to the nation of Israel, but ultimately we see later that Jesus comes and restores all things, makes all things new. My question for you is simply this. In the same way as they were living, are you living a life characterized by hypocrisy? Are you producing fruit that is contrary to the Word of God, producing fruit that's contrary to the commands of God? And next thing you know, you see yourself just like them. You have plowed iniquity. You've plowed sin. You have reaped injustice. You've been indifferent to it. You have eaten the fruit of lies. What fruit are you producing in your life? Is it fruit that only comes from someone who is sowing themselves righteousness and reaping steadfast love, or is it coming from someone who has plowed the iniquity, reaped injustice? If we seek him, if we truly seek him, not just acknowledge him, but seek him, live for him, the same promise is true that righteousness may rain down upon us.